Good afternoon, everybody. People have been asking me to put my personal testimony on Facebook in a video, so here goes. April of 2008, I became ill, and the doctors took 6 months to accurately diagnose me with pancreatic cancer. It was stage 1 to 2, and it's unheard of for it to be diagnosed that early. Actually, with them taking so long to diagnose me, I found out after the fact that it should have been stage 4, and I should have already been dead before they were able to give me any treatment at all. So that journey began. Prayer was made from the beginning of the journey and continually throughout the journey. At the very beginning, before we knew exactly what was wrong, we went home that night from the doctor's office because every diagnosis they had given us had a death sentence attached to it. So I was sitting on the couch, and God spoke to me and said, it's going to get really, really, really bad. But you're going to make it. Because I guess God knew I would need that word from him. And then God said the part that I laughed at. He told me I needed to tell my husband because he was going to encourage me. And my husband had always seen the glass as half empty, whereas I had always seen it as half full. Not a good situation. So when I went outside that night to tell my husband that God had spoken to me, and in our marriage at that point, I'd only audibly heard the voice of God like 3 times. He knew that every time I told him that you could take it to the bank, it was going to happen. So I went outside and I told him, and we both started crying, and we just held each other. We had no clue what the next 2 years would bring or how bad it could really get. 6 months of outpatient surgical procedures every 3 to 4 weeks. They would do what's called an ERCP, where they go down your throat and they would inspect my pancreas and the tubes leading into it, and it kept getting gunk in the tubes leading into it, and they would clean it out and put a new tube in. So finally in August, this started in April, and so in August they went back in and they did some biopsies. The biopsies came back non-conclusive. They couldn't tell. And one would say, yes, you have it. Another would say, no, you don't have it. Talk about a roller coaster ride you could not get off of. You didn't know whether to be happy or sad. So in August, I went in, they did another ERCP. A couple days later, the doctor called us at home. At this point, we were friends because we had been in his office so much. And at the very beginning, when we went in his office, even before they had real test results, I remember sitting in his office as they saw everybody and made everybody leave, and then they locked the doors, and then they took us back in a room. Let me tell you, when they do that, you know it's not good. And we had stopped at a Christian bookstore, and I'd bought some Christian books, and they were about faith. And he looked at me and he said, my gut tells me that you have pancreatic cancer, even without getting results and doing the test, just based on your blood work. He said, and you're going to need your faith. That's the only thing that's going to get you through this. Little did I know how true his words would be. So that started our journey. A journey I didn't ask to go on. And I've written a book called Surprised by God with Pancreatic Cancer. Did God give me pancreatic cancer? Doubtful. But I believe God lowered the hedge and let the devil at me to see what I was made of. And the pancreatic cancer was a result of that. And it's why I am who I am today. Without it, I would probably still be sitting on my couch, living my life, not accomplishing anything for God. But because of that, I have a drive now that doesn't stop. And I've got to share that God still does miracles, and he does the impossible things. And I want other people to know what God can do for them. But anyway, back to my testimony. I do get distracted, sorry. So we were home that day in August, and I had not worked since April. And the phone rang, and it was the doctor on my cell phone. So I answered it, and he said, is your husband there? And I said, yeah. He goes, can you put me on speaker? I don't normally do this, but I know you guys, and I need to tell you over the phone because we have to move fast. And so I got my husband in there, and he said, Susan, I hate to tell you this, but you have pancreatic cancer, and I've got to call into the surgeon. And you're going to need to go up there in the next couple of days, and you need to come here and get all your medical records because you're going to need to take them with you, and they're going to have to operate very quickly to save your life. What do you say? 2 days later, We were in Morgantown, West Virginia at Ruby Memorial Hospital, talking to the head of oncology. What am I doing sitting talking to a cancer doctor? Why do I have cancer? I mean, there were a lot of questions that run through your head. As we were sitting there, originally that doctor had told me that if I had to have surgery, it would be what's called a modified Whipple, which has a greater chance at living. In 2008, the odds for living after a Whipple were 1 in 4. And so as I was reading the paperwork and I saw that it said Whipple, I looked at my surgeon and I said, "You told me a modified Whipple. This says a Whipple." I knew that my chances to live had just been cut in half. And he looked at me and he said, "I'm sorry. This is your only chance at life." So to keep from crying, I looked at him and I said, while you're in there, I've had this problem with my midsection since I had my kids. Could you take care of that for me? I mean, if you got to take everything out to get to the pancreas, could you suck the fat out too? And he looked at me and he started laughing and he said, "You are going to be my success story because you know how to laugh." Well, we kept it light until we got to the car and then we started crying. I called my friend Tammy in Houston, one of the first calls we made, and we called our family. You know, how do you tell your mom that August the 18th, you're dying? By the way, what would you like done at my funeral? How do you tell your children? A 14-year-old and a young lady who's starting college the day they're going to operate on her mother. Yeah. How do you say? How do you ask your 14-year-old, would you like to be one of my pallbearers? Is there any songs you'd like sung? Yeah, those were the decisions we had to make. But anyway, as we left the hospital that day, we called close friends and family, pastors, to start planning the funeral. Because the surgeon said he wouldn't operate on me until the funeral was planned. And I guess it's never really hit me just how big the miracle's been. But it's been quite a ride. Quite a ride. So we went and I called my friend Tammy in Houston and she said, "Susie, you need to talk to Brother Kilgore, Bishop Kilgore." He was still alive at that point. And I said, "Tammy, I haven't talked to him in so many years. He's not going to remember my voice." And she said, "It's like this. If you don't call him, I'm going to call him and he's going to call you, but you're talking to him in the next 5 minutes." And so I said, okay, and she gave me his number and I called him. And I don't know how many of you all knew our wonderful Bishop Kilgore, but he never forgot a voice or a face. And I had worked for him in the office as one of his secretaries at one point. So I called him and he answered. And as soon as he heard my voice, he knew who I was. And he said, "What is it?" And so I told him, and I was crying naturally. And I said, "I'm afraid because I can't pray. I can't feel God." I said, "All I can hear is this roar in my head that says you're going to die." And he said, "Susie, you've always prayed for everybody. It's our turn now to pray for you. And I'm going to be on speed dial for you. Anytime you need me, you call me and I will pray." And sure enough, up until the day he died, he was on speed dial. As I traversed this road of cancer and treatments and surgeries and hospital stays, and they even did surgery on me one night in my room because my white blood cell count was going up and they couldn't figure out why. I remember being rushed down the halls one night on a Sunday evening and they had me too medicated for me to call anybody. And I remember looking up as they were pushing the gurney through the halls, and I remember saying, "God, I thought you said I was going to make it. You know, it'd be real nice if you showed up right now and you did something." But for some reason, God wanted me to go through the valley of the shadow of death. Maybe so I can encourage others that sometimes it's not an immediate miracle. Sometimes it's a gradual healing. And there may be people you need to meet along the road to encourage that you'd never run into and you'd never meet. But because you've traveled that road, people will listen now when you talk because they know that you've suffered, that you've been there. You've got the scars. So anyway, I went home and I started chemotherapy. I lost 40 pounds in just a couple of months. Started chemo the week before Christmas. Merry Christmas, right? Went to Houston in the interim too for a second opinion. Found out I needed end-stage chemo. My body did not react well with it. Every other week I was in the hospital. And the last few months, an ambulance and the ambulance drivers were at my house every other week because I could not walk. They had to literally pick me up and carry me to put me on the gurney. That's how weak I was. And towards the end, I contracted what's called VRE, which is viroenterococca, something or the other, some long name. Worse than what is called MRSA, which MRSA is an infection in the blood, and that's what VRE is. And my port they'd inserted for my chemo had gotten infected. But we didn't know that in the beginning, and I remember they took me to the hospital, and I'd come back home. My daughter had come in from college, and in the interim, my husband had been admitted to a hospital for diverticulitis. So I was going to be home alone. But my son had a science fair that night. I had to, when I got out of the car from the hospital, I literally crawled up the steps in my house to my bedroom and changed clothes and scooted down the steps and told my daughter to take me to the high school because I was not having my son be disappointed that not one of his parents could be at his science fair. And yes, I know it was stupid, but I love my children. And so I went to the science fair. I only stayed 10 minutes, long enough to have pictures taken, long enough for him to know that his mama loved him more than anything. And then I went back home, got back on that couch, and I was running a fever. The nurse came. It was the next day. The pharmacist come to the house. I found out doctors can come to the house when you're sick enough. And the pharmacist came to drop off my medications because I had an IV in each arm, an IV in my stomach, and a port right here around my shoulder area. The pharmacist came in because I had the door open because I couldn't get up to open the door. And so he came in and he said, "Are you here alone?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I'm fine. Everybody will be here in a couple of hours." And he said, "I don't feel comfortable leaving you." I was under all these blankets shivering. Anyway, he went outside and he called the home health agency and they sent the nurse rather quickly. He waited till she got there. And when she walked in, she said, "What's up with you?" And I said, "I'm just cold. I can't get warm." She took my temperature. It was 105.8. That's pretty much at seizure. And she looked at me. She said, "You need to go back to the hospital." And I started crying and I said, "I don't want to go. No. I'm going to die. I've had enough. I've had enough of watching my kids look at me and seeing that they're losing hope. I can't put them through anymore. I'm done. Just let me die." And she looked at me, she said, "Do you want them to walk by this couch and realize that this is where their mother died?" And I looked at her and I said, "That's low." I said, "Call the ambulance." So she called the ambulance. And anyway, family was gotten a hold of and they were told that they'd be lucky if I lived till the next day. Found out later I was turning gray. That's the color you turn when you're dying. They rushed me to the hospital. They didn't stop in the ER. They took me straight up to a room. And I was admitted. I was in the hospital 2 weeks that time. It was Mother's Day. My family was not allowed to touch me when they came in. They had to be gowned and gloved. I'm dying and no one can touch me. They didn't know what was going on. The first 2 nights I was in the hospital, they had no clue what was going on. They had me on all kinds of antibiotics. The second night, about midnight, the nurse came in to change the IV bags and I started seizing. You know, that was God, that she walked in the room right then. Because if she hadn't walked in the room, I would be dead today. So that was a miracle right there. Anyway, they got infectious disease involved and were running more tests. And a couple days later, they found out it was my port that was infected. And they took it out. It still took me 2 weeks to get me back to where I could at least go home. I remember my primary cancer doctor sitting in the room across from me. And nowadays they have big meetings with all the family involved. But in my case, God wanted me alone. So it was just me and him. Me and that cancer doctor. And of course, God was with me. And he sat across from me and he said, "Susan, I don't know what to do about your chemotherapy. I've never watched anybody suffer quite like I've watched you suffer." And I looked at him and I said, "Your chemo's killing you." And I said, "Well, that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to kill the good cells and the bad cells." he said, yeah, but in your case, it literally is going to kill you. And I looked at him and I said, well, what would you tell your wife if she was laying in this bed instead of me? And he said, I couldn't advise her either. And so we talked about what we would do if I continued, what we would do if I didn't. And I guess we made a decision that day to just stop everything. I was supposed to have end-stage radiation in addition to the end-stage chemotherapy. I never finished my chemotherapy, and I never did radiation. And several months later, maybe about a year, in 2010, I came to Houston to be tested by MD Anderson, and I didn't realize I was well. And we went through the test, and we were in the doctor's office, me and a friend of mine, and we were sitting there, and she said, they're taking too long. And she got up to look out the door, and she said, Susan, they're out there crying and fist bumping, and they're so happy. And I was like, really? And she's like, yeah. So the doctor comes in, and the doctor was crying, and she says, Susan, I never get to say this, but you're in remission. And so it's been almost 8 years since the original diagnosis, 6 since I went into remission. Typically, no one goes 5 years without a recurrence of pancreatic cancer. I counsel now for the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network, American Cancer Society, Emmerman's Angels, a whole lot of places. And I do this missionary thing. And I write books. But I still have to treat my body. Right, because you see, I walk with a limp these days. And that limp is what's made me who I am. It's why I worship the way I worship. It's why I walk the way I walk. It's why I talk the way I talk. It's why I believe my God can do anything, and He wants to be your God too. We've got to understand that miracles, signs, and wonders are for us today. And just like that video that I posted a few days ago about the man that I counseled with, and I had his permission, that, he had a tumor, and the tumor disappeared, literally. And he had a test from prior to when he was in the hospital where the tumor was still there, and they said the chemo wasn't working. And then he goes to this hospital, and he's admitted because he thinks he's dying, and the tumor is gone. You can't tell me God can't. You see, you've come way too late. My God can do anything. He can reach inside you and take a tumor out. He can heal the blind eyes. The deaf ears can be unstopped. The lame can walk. We're the ones who are hindering the work of God because we don't want to pray. We don't want to put our time into it. But you see, God took me alone to where I had to pray, to where I had to get on my knees, to where I had to touch heaven for me. Many people touched heaven throughout the world for me. But when you're alone in that hospital room and very few people come to visit you, and I mean, other than my family, I can count on one hand the people that came to see me in those 2 years. Yeah. But God was with me. God wanted me alone. He wanted me to know that, yea, though I was walking through the valley of the shadow of death, I would fear no evil because He was with me. He anointed my head with oil. My cup runneth over now. You see, I'm on the other side. And no, life's not perfect. I still have issues. 2.5 years ago, my husband died of a prescription drug overdose. A few months before that, Brother Kilgore had died. Or a few months after that, Brother Kilgore died. And then a month after that, my father died. Oh, this story goes on and on. But you just need to know that God can do anything. All we have to do is ask and believe. That's what the Bible says. Isaiah tells us that by His stripes we are healed. It doesn't say maybe. It says we are healed. And the Bible tells us miracles, signs, and wonders shall follow them that believe. So we need to start believing. We need to start putting some legs on our prayers. We need to start praying. We need to start finding our knees again. I want a PhD in theology. I don't want the miracle God gave me. I don't want Him to ever think He shouldn't have done that. I want to know that I know. And I want to know that I've done everything to take everybody to heaven with me that I can. And I also want to know that I've done everything that I can to encourage everyone that what God did for me, He wants to do for you. God is no respecter of persons. He loves all of us the same. It's time for all of us to understand that and to get it. You see, before my husband died, the passage that God gave me that morning, and I thought it was for somebody else, was in Zechariah 13:9. And I will bring the third part through the fire, and will refine them as silver is refined, and will try them as gold is tried. They shall call on my name, and I will hear them. I will say, it is my people, and they shall say, the Lord is my God. I've walked through the valley of the shadow of death for myself and for my loved ones. Now I'm walking in life. Now I'm giving God everything. It's time for all of us to be surrendered to God in a whole new way. And that's where we will find the mountains. We will be able to go from mountaintop to mountaintop. Yeah, there'll be valleys in the middle. But because we know how to pray and we know how to worship, we'll be able to worship our way through the valley, knowing that God is walking with us as we walk into doctor's offices and as we get bad news after bad news, or as the phone rings and we find out another person's died in our family, or there's been another tragedy, or there's been something else that we didn't plan on happening. You just got to know that Jesus is there and He's with you and He loves you. And it's time for us to call for the elders of the church and let them pray, anointing with oil. It's also time for us to know that when we're sitting in doctor's offices, if God tells us to reach across and start talking to somebody, we start talking to them. Because you don't know what results they're waiting on. You have no clue. And when you reach across and start talking to them, then you can, after you've talked a few minutes, you can say, would you mind if I said a quick little prayer? It don't have to be some big prayer. It can just be, Jesus, you know what's going on here. We're asking you to touch them. And we're believing you for a miracle. And we thank you for it in Jesus' name. I've seen more miracles done with those simple little prayers than I have with those great big things. And everybody has the ability. We all have been endued with power from on high. We are all called to be witnesses. So step out and be a witness. Walk across the street to your neighbor's house if God impresses you to. Talk to the person you're behind in the grocery store. The person you meet in the market or at the mall. Say something to them. Smile. Let them see Jesus through you, because as Brother Kilgore would have said, we're all ambassadors of Jesus Christ. It's time for us to act as such. I'm sorry, this is my bandwagon and I get on it. But one thing I do want to leave you with. I felt like Job there for a while. And all I could say was, though He slay me, I will trust Him. And you see, God didn't slay Job either. But God allowed the hedge to be taken down and allowed the devil to get at him. Don't blame God for your trials. Don't blame God for your illnesses. Thank Him that He trusts you. Thank Him. Let Him carry you through those valleys. Let Him love you through those valleys. And God will do a miracle inside of you that will be bigger than any physical miracle He could give you. Y'all have a blessed day. Know I love you and I'm praying for you. And those that I have been working with and counseling with who have cancer, know that you are constantly in my prayers. And anytime you need me, you call me. Love y'all. God bless.